Liam Carter had spent years serving in the Australian SASR, seeing action in some of the most hostile environments on Earth. Now, all he wanted was a quiet life on the Gold Coast, a place where he could enjoy the ocean breeze, fire up the Barbie on weekends, and not have to worry about anything more serious than whether the Wallabies would win their next match. So, when he installed a state-of-the-art security gate at his new home, he thought nothing of it. It was sleek, modern, and, most importantly, completely within the HOA regulations. He'd triple-checked the bylaws, applied for all the right permits, and even went the extra mile to match the design with the rest of the neighborhood. But Liam had underestimated one thing: Margaret Doyle, the self-appointed dictator of the Gold Coast Heights HOA. A former lawyer with a god complex and a love for control, Margaret believed she owned the neighborhood. Nothing happened on her turf without her say-so. The day after Liam's gate went up, she struck back. First came the letters, thinly veiled threats disguised as compliance notices. Then came the whispered rumors that Liam was planning to turn his house into a private security compound, that his ugly fortress was dragging down property values. And then, late one night, Liam's security cameras caught something disturbing. Margaret and her cronies, measuring his property in the dark, plotting their next move. Liam Carter had faced militants in the Middle East, survived missions in enemy-infested jungles, and spent years in high-stakes covert operations. But he never expected his toughest battle to be against a 62-year-old woman in a pastel cardigan. Margaret Doyle wasn't just playing dirty, she was playing for blood. The morning after catching Margaret and her cronies snooping around his property in the dead of night, Liam woke up to a bright red violation notice plastered across his front gate. Immediate action required. Unauthorized modification. Failure to comply will result in daily fines of $1,000 per day. Margaret wasn't just sending a warning, she was trying to financially choke him out. But Liam wasn't the type to back down. He took the letter, marched straight to the HOA office, and slammed it on the counter. Your rules clearly state that security gates are permitted as long as they match the home's aesthetic and do not exceed 8 feet. Mine is 7 feet 10. So explain to me, where exactly is the violation? Margaret, sitting smugly behind her polished mahogany desk, didn't even blink. Your gate, she said, adjusting her pearl necklace, creates an unfriendly atmosphere. It intimidates your neighbors. Liam couldn't help but laugh. You mean you feel intimidated? Margaret's smile thinned. Mr. Carter, this community has standards. If you're not willing to comply, perhaps you should consider living somewhere else. Translation: get rid of the gate, or get out. Liam left without another word, but he wasn't done fighting. That night, he reviewed every security recording from the past week, and what he found made his blood boil. Margaret had been visiting neighbors, going door to door with a petition against him. On camera, he saw her pointing at his house, exaggerating wildly, showing doctored images of his gate looking 3 times bigger and pitch black, like a military compound. She wasn't just spreading rumors, she was creating them. Then came the nail in the coffin. At exactly 2:37 a.m., his security system pinged again. This time, it wasn't just Margaret and her HOA minions. It was 2 men in black tactical gear measuring his driveway, scribbling something in a notepad. And in Margaret's hand, a business card. Liam zoomed in on the footage, then quickly searched the company name: Black Shield Security, Private Enforcement Specialists. His stomach dropped. This wasn't a neighborhood dispute anymore. Margaret wasn't just trying to fine him, she was bringing in hired muscle, and Liam knew exactly what that meant. She was planning to use force. What would you do if your HOA hired a private security force to intimidate you? Drop it in the comments if you'd stand your ground like Liam. Smash that like button if you think Margaret is about to learn a lesson the hard way. And don't forget to subscribe, because trust me, this war is just getting started. Next episode, when the Black Shield Mercenaries arrive and make a huge mistake. 3. The HOA's private army, a show of force. Liam Carter knew trouble was coming. Margaret Doyle had crossed the line, And from what he saw on his security footage, she wasn't just playing mind games anymore. She was bringing in private enforcers. At exactly 7:15 a.m., Liam was sipping his morning coffee on the front porch when he heard it, the unmistakable growl of heavy-duty SUVs rolling up his driveway. 3 black vehicles. The doors swung open and 6 men in tactical gear stepped out, all clad in black combat uniforms, utility belts strapped with weapons, and radios crackling with static. One of them was holding the leash of a massive Belgian Malinois, its ears perked, its muscles tense, ready to strike at the slightest command. Liam set his coffee down, so this was it. The man in front, tall, broad-shouldered, with a scar running down his cheek, stepped forward, arms crossed. His name tag read, K. Morrison. "You must be Carter," Morrison said, his voice sharp, practiced. Liam didn't move. "That's me." Morrison pulled a folder from his vest and tossed it onto the ground between them. "This is your final notice. Your illegal gate violates community standards. You have 24 hours to remove it, or we will." Liam didn't even glance at the folder. He kept his eyes on Morrison. "You do realize that impersonating law enforcement is illegal in Australia, right?" Morrison smirked. "We're not impersonating anything. We're HOA enforcement." The other men started spreading out, one walking the perimeter of Liam's property, another snapping photos of his security cameras, another measuring the width of his driveway. The dog handler tugged at the leash, making the Malinois growl threateningly. "You see, mate," Morrison continued, stepping closer, "Margaret Doyle has hired us to maintain the integrity of this neighborhood. You're the problem, and problems—" He tapped the side of his gun holster. "Get dealt with." Liam held his ground. "You've made 2 mistakes today." Morrison raised an eyebrow. "Oh yeah?" Liam nodded. 1, this gate is 100% legal. I've got all the permits, and I can prove it. 2, he glanced at the dog, your K9 unit isn't registered. Morrison's smirk faltered for half a second. Liam folded his arms, his voice calm, steady. "See, I did some digging last night. Your company isn't licensed to operate with attack-trained dogs in this district. That means, if you even think about unleashing that dog on me, you're not just violating a few regulations." He leaned in slightly. "You're committing a crime." Morrison clenched his jaw. The other men exchanged uneasy glances. Liam took another step forward. "Now, let me tell you what's really going to happen. You're going to get back in those shiny black SUVs and drive away before you dig yourselves into a hole you can't climb out of." Morrison hesitated, then turned to his men. "Let's go." One by one, the Black Shield enforcers filed back into their vehicles. The dog handler yanked the Malinois back, and with a final glare, they peeled out of Liam's driveway, the sound of screeching tires echoing through the quiet street. As Liam watched them go, his gaze drifted to a figure standing further down the street. Margaret Doyle. She was filming everything, smiling like she had just won a battle. She had no idea that Liam had already set a trap. The trap is set. Time to take down the HOA tyrant. Liam Carter didn't just watch Black Shield's security drive away. He memorized every single detail. The logos on their vehicles, the badges on their chests, even the way Morrison clenched his jaw when he realized he'd been caught. Because here's the thing. Liam wasn't just a former soldier. He knew how to fight a war. And this was a war. That night, Liam sat down at his computer, pulled up the security footage, and began compiling the evidence. He zoomed in on Morrison's so-called badge. It wasn't an official security license. He ran a check on Black Shield Security. They weren't even registered to operate in Queensland. Illegal security firm? Check. Unlicensed K9 unit? Check. Threats of violence on camera? Check. Then, just as Liam was saving the files, another alert popped up on his security system. Someone was outside. Liam pulled up the live feed, and there she was. Margaret Doyle, standing at the end of his driveway. She wasn't alone. 2 men in dark clothing stood next to her, gesturing toward his gate, whispering. One of them pulled out a crowbar. Liam felt his pulse slow, the same way it did before a fight. They were going to destroy the gate themselves. Liam didn't call the police. He had a better idea. Instead of stopping them immediately, he hit record on every single camera angle. He let them pry at the gate, let them damage the hinges, let them make fools of themselves on camera. Then, when Margaret stepped forward to give her final approval, Liam switched on the floodlights. The entire street lit up like a stadium. Margaret froze. The 2 men jumped back, caught like rabbits in a trap. Liam walked out the front door, arms crossed. "Evening, Margaret," he said casually. "Bit late for a stroll, don't you think?" Margaret's face twisted with rage. This is private property!" Liam smirked. "Yeah, mine." He lifted his phone, screen glowing with the live recording. "And guess what? I just caught you and your little security team on camera committing vandalism." The 2 men turned and bolted, but it was too late. Liam had everything he needed. Margaret pointed a shaking finger at him. "You don't understand who you're messing with? I have connections. Liam stepped forward. "You made 3 mistakes tonight, Margaret. 1, you tried to intimidate the wrong guy. 2, you hired fake security enforcers with no legal authority. And 3, you just committed a crime." Margaret's face drained of color. Liam raised an eyebrow, tilting his phone toward her. How do you think the Gold Coast City Council will feel about their HOA president vandalizing private property? Margaret stumbled back, but before she could say another word, the sound of sirens filled the air. The distant wail of sirens grew louder, cutting through the tense silence like a blade. Margaret Doyle whipped around, her face flashing with panic as 3 police cruisers screeched to a stop at the end of Liam's driveway. This wasn't part of her plan. 2 uniformed officers stepped out first, scanning the scene. Liam standing tall, phone in hand, while Margaret and her hired thugs stood frozen under the blinding floodlights. Then, the third car door opened, and out stepped Detective Aaron Blake of the Queensland Police Force, a no-nonsense officer who had zero tolerance for power-hungry HOA dictators. He adjusted his belt, eyes narrowing as he took in the scene. "All right," he said, voice sharp. "Someone want to tell me why I got a report of an unlicensed security force operating in a suburban street?" Margaret found her voice first. "Detective, thank goodness you're here. This man," she jabbed a finger at Liam, "is a menace. He's defying HOA regulations, and I had to take action for the sake of the community." Blake didn't even look at her. Instead, he turned to Liam. "Carter, you called this in?" Liam nodded, flipping his phone around. "I've got everything recorded. Illegal intimidation tactics, trespassing, vandalism, and impersonating law enforcement." Blake's eyes flicked to the security footage playing on the screen. Margaret shifted uneasily, then changed tactics. "I was just ensuring compliance. The HOA has full authority over—" "Not in my jurisdiction, you don't." Blake cut her off, turning to the officers. "Check their credentials." 2 officers moved in. Morrison, the Black Shield enforcer, stood rigid as one officer yanked the badge from his chest. The other officer ran a check on their vehicle plates. Seconds later, the results came in. Blake frowned. "That's funny. According to the system, Black Shield security doesn't exist. No registered business, no active security licenses." Liam smirked, exactly as he suspected. Margaret, however, was desperate. "Detective, you don't understand. These men were just helping me protect our neighborhood from people like him." Blake raised an eyebrow. "People like who?" "Homeowners who follow the law?" Margaret's mouth snapped shut. One of the officers approached Blake, holding up a folded piece of paper. "Sir, we checked. HOA funds were used to pay these men under a fraudulent contract, money taken without board approval." Blake's expression darkened. "Well, that settles it." He turned to Margaret. "You're under arrest for misuse of funds, hiring unlicensed security, and conspiracy to intimidate a resident." Margaret staggered back, shaking her head wildly. "No, you can't. This is all a misunderstanding." Blake ignored her, gesturing to his officers. "Cuff her." As the handcuffs clicked around Margaret's wrists, her empire crumbled. The so-called Black Shield enforcers, realizing the game was up, raised their hands and surrendered. One of them even muttered, "We were just doing a job." Blake's gaze was ice cold. "Yeah? Tell that to the judge." As Margaret was led to the police car, she whipped her head around, glaring at Liam. "This isn't over, Carter," she spat. Liam just smiled. "Yeah, it is." The police car sped away, and with it, Margaret Doyle's reign over the neighborhood was officially dead. With Margaret Doyle gone, the silence in the neighborhood felt deafening. Liam Carter stood on his porch watching as the last of the Black Shield enforcers were shoved into the police vans. Their once threatening SUVs, now impounded, sat abandoned at the end of the street. The self-proclaimed queen of the HOA had fallen, and the kingdom she ruled with an iron fist was crumbling. But Liam knew the battle wasn't over just yet. By morning, the fallout had already begun. The HOA board, those who had been too afraid to speak up against Margaret, called for an emergency meeting. For the first time in years, homeowners gathered without fear of retribution. Liam attended, sitting in the back as residents stood up one by one, revealing the full extent of Margaret's corruption. A single mother recounted how Margaret forced her to repaint her house 3 times in one summer because it was the wrong shade of beige. An elderly couple broke down in tears as they revealed they had paid thousands in fake fines, afraid of losing their home. A retired veteran spoke up, recalling how Margaret ordered him to take down his Australian flag because she deemed it too large and distracting. It was worse than Liam had imagined. Then came the final revelation. Financial records unearthed by the police showed Margaret had been embezzling HOA funds for years. The security budget she claimed was for community patrols? Most of it had been funneled into her personal bank account. The anger in the room was electric. By the end of the night, the entire HOA board voted to permanently remove Margaret Doyle from her position. In her place, a new leader was elected. Mr. Roberts, a soft-spoken retired teacher who had always believed in fairness. The first thing he did? Tore up every unfair rule Margaret had imposed. The second thing? Approved Liam's gate. Permanently. And as poetic justice, other neighbors began installing similar gates of their own. What once had been Margaret's greatest enemy was now the new trend of the neighborhood. But the biggest twist of all? A month later, Liam got a notification on his phone. A new security alert. He pulled up the footage and nearly choked on his coffee. There, outside a new house on the other side of town, stood Margaret Doyle. She was holding a measuring tape, standing in front of a brand new, top-of-the-line security gate. She was installing one for herself. Liam leaned back in his chair, shaking his head. In the end, even Margaret had realized his gate wasn't the problem. She just hated that she wasn't the one controlling it.